Welcome, friends. Good evening. My name is Micah McCall-Nicholson, and I serve Friends as FCNL's Program Associate for Quaker Engagement. And I'm joining you all from Washington, D.C., which is located on the ancestral and current lands of the Nacotchtank, or Anacostan, and Piscataway peoples. I'm excited to welcome you to our Quaker Changemaker event, Friends Witness and Action for Our Democracy, which will begin shortly. Before we get started, though, I'd like to ask my colleague, Lindsay Bensick, to share a little bit about how we'll gather this evening on this wonderful virtual platform.
Hi, friends. Good evening. I'm Lindsay. I'm the administrative assistant for FCNL's Governance, Community, and Culture team, and I'm helping run technology for tonight's event. So before we get started, I just have a few tech considerations to go over. First, say hello in the chat. Share your name, location, and your meeting or church, if any, as well as the ancestral land that you live on or that you're zooming in from this evening. It's a great way to build community virtually, and it's really fun to see who's here in the chat. And I've posted a link to Native Lands map, so you can find out for yourself if you don't already know. As you can see, we are recording this evening's speaker portions, but the audience will not be included in the recording for privacy reasons. Even so, feel free to turn off your video if you're uncomfortable leaving it on. Captioning is available automatically. If you don't want to see the captions, you can click on the live transcript option on your Zoom toolbar and click Hide Subtitles. We'll have some time for you to ask questions towards the end of the event, and we'll do our best to address as many questions as we have time for, but probably will not have time to get to all of them. But please submit your questions in the chat and include your name, location, or meeting or church affiliation, if any, and I will be sure to direct them to the panelists. Lastly, please contact me if you are in need of tech support. You can private message me in Zoom's chat bar, or you can email me at lbensick@fcnl.org, which I've just put in the chat. And with that, I will hand it back to you, Micah.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. As someone who's ran tech before, I appreciate all the support that you'll offer us this evening. So again, before we get into our program this evening, election and campaign season is stressful for many different reasons, not just this current one. So will you join me all in a minute of grounding silence before we get into this work? Thank you, friends. And welcome again to this month's Quaker Changemaker event, Friends Witness and Action for Our Democracy. Tonight, as we approach a contentious election in the United States in less than a week, we gather to hear from two friends who have answered the call to live into a faithful witness around issues of democracy and their actions. If these two speakers look familiar, it may be for many reasons, but specifically because this conversation began on October 1st with an inaugural live event with the Quaker podcast, How to Vote Like a Quaker. They spoke at this event a mere 4 weeks ago to the concerns that many friends and non-Quakers were feeling, a sense that there is something deeply fractured across our communities and political systems. As we approach Election Day on Tuesday, November 5th, there's a lot being discussed in public and private spaces about the democratic processes in this country. In the following weeks, we will settle into the results of this major decision that will impact the future of our nation's local, state, and federal governments, as well as our interactions with those governments of other countries. Our conversation today will engage both the short-term realities of a presidential election, as well as the larger discernments we are being called to make on how we all show up to witnesses for truth, justice, and integrity. We will discuss what we can do in this moment and how we can sustain these efforts in the long term. I also want to offer, as a reminder for this evening's program, and as we move through this campaign season, that FCNL is a nonpartisan Quaker lobbying organization. That means that we work with leaders and organizations across the political spectrum toward shared goals. Just a consideration for what comments we're sending in the chat, but feel free to discuss as you may. And at this moment, I want to introduce the two people who will be joining me in this conversation, Emily Provance and Diane Randall, who are hopefully pinned on your screens beside me. And they'll be sharing their perspectives on the challenging state of American democracy and the role of faith-based action in Capitol Hill and local communities across the country. I'll introduce them a little bit before I offer them a moment to do so themselves. Emily Provance is a Quaker traveling minister from 15th Street Meeting in New York City. She has been traveling widely among friends this year to speak about the peace-building discipline of election violence prevention, which is drawn in part from the knowledge of Kenyan friends who have generously shared their experience with this work. More generally, her ministry is focused on helping people who are very different work together on things they all care about. She has a deep faith in the power of relationships as the most reliable pathway to peace and to change. You may have seen her also last year if you attended FCNL's annual meeting, where she served faithfully as our worship leader. Join me in welcoming Emily Provance. And we also have joining us this evening Diane Randall, who worships with Friends Meeting of Washington in Washington, D.C. She served as FCNL's General Secretary from 2011 to 2021, working on the Hill throughout the presidential elections of 2016 and 2020, and she continues to carry a concern for how Friends' faith and practice are manifested in public ministry, especially in this challenging era of social and political conflict. She also serves on the steering committee of the Urgent Call to the Religious Society of Friends concerning democracy in the United States, in addition to a number of other roles that we have not mentioned. Welcome me in joining Diane Randall for this conversation. So to get into things, I'm really honored and excited for this conversation with you both, and to hear more about how your experiences in some of these efforts to strengthen our communities, and to hear how your faith has grounded you in this work. So let's jump in. I want to ask you both to briefly describe the work that you have been doing and how your practice with Quakerism has grounded that witness. Diane, do you want to start us off?
Sure. Well, thank you, Micah, very much for your work in organizing this. And it's always great to be connected with Friends Committee on National Legislation. It is great to see so many friends on this call who I've known and worked with, and who I really know to be peace builders, know to be people who understand how to address conflict and how to address justice. So it's always good to be with other friends in that category. Of course, I'm a big admirer of Emily's work and what she has been doing to educate herself and friends and people in communities about election violence and how we can understand it. And so we're going to, I know, talk a lot more about that. So mostly I'm retired, and people who know me from FCNL know that when I left FCNL, I stayed here in Washington, D.C., and now I'm a member of Friends Meeting in Washington. And so I'm thrilled to be engaged in a local meeting again and have that be part of my faith community and a place of worship. And as we talk tonight about Quaker faith and practice and how it prepares us for times of conflict and times of anxiety, I think we all have examples of ways that we do that in our communities of faith, Quaker meetings, but also in our personal practices and in our prayer lives. I guess I just say a little bit about myself. I mean, I feel like one of the things that I have really reflected on a lot since I started working with the Quaker Call in the beginning of 2022. And I think we're going to talk more about that later, but I've thought a lot more about democracy, and I've thought a lot about democracy in relation to being a Quaker and what the relationship is, because one is really a political system and one is a religious system, but there are similarities in how we practice those. And Where I come from a faith perspective, is the belief in the inherent dignity of every person, and a belief in a sense of equality, and the call to what Jesus taught us, which is that we are to love one another and we are to love God. And so if we think about what that looks like in our lives, that can feel very far from the political systems that we're in. And yet that is part of what we endeavor to do. It's part of what FCNL endeavors to do. And so I feel like it's really important to try to, for those of us who are people of faith, to bring together the spiritual grounding that we have as people who believe in the Spirit, who seek to understand the divine, and as people who are part of a community and understand how does that function with our political lives. And so, you know, I grew up at a time when people said, don't talk about religion or politics. And now it feels to me that's like all I can think about and talk about it, because they are both so alive and so meaningful to me personally. I'll pause there because I know we're going to get into some other questions as we go forward.
Thanks all. And I'm just excited to see how many people are on this call that I really love. I was shuffling through your faces and just lighting up, and that includes Diane and Micah and Lindsay, but also so many of the others. I wish that we could go have cookies together when we finish the conversation tonight, and that's just not how Zoom works, but I'm missing that. For me, the work that I've been doing in the last 18 months or so started with a concern in the old Quaker sense of, you know, something spiritual laid on your heart. And for me, it was, I've always believed that the peace testimony, that most of how it works is that we need to take the action before the violence begins, because to stop violence is so much harder than to prevent it. And so, for me, it was a tugging of the heart of what are we going to do about the possibility of physical violence or really serious intimidation attached to the election cycle. And by studying and reading and listening and talking to an enormous sort of ideological diversity of people, I have learned and confirmed with actual data that 98% of us in this country do not approve of any kind of violence attached to the election cycle. 98% are saying no to that. We have an enormous supermajority. And so my question has been about how do we work together as this enormous supermajority to prevent violence from getting started? I've learned that as we're having cross-partisan conversations, that these are really cross-cultural conversations. And so part of the question we were asked was, how does the Quaker background help us here? And for me, it's about the tension that comes forward when I'm trying to pull together a cross-cultural, cross-partisan group, and how scary that is for people, and finding the ways of grounding that in deep spiritual grounding and listening in tongues and what I think of as a clerking mindset. So bringing that Quaker sense of the meeting to these kinds of conversations. I just want to end by giving you a really fast story. There's an organization called Braver Angels that I won't tell you about right now, but they published something called the Trustworthy Elections Report, which was the result of a long cross-partisan conversation about bringing up trust in the elections. And when I heard the synthesis group give their report about their experience of putting this together, they were talking about things like, you know, I was able to trust the group so much that I knew that they would not put something in the report that I believed to be absolutely wrong. And the kind of deep listening that we learned to do to one another stretched me into new places that I didn't know I could go to. And I was listening to that and I was like, oh my gosh, this is Quaker discernment being discovered in the wild. That's what this is. So again, it's about leaning on that sense of the meeting in these conversations for me.
Thank you both so much. I want to continue with our conversation and dive into Friends' role in our democracy, and how pivotal this discussion is as we situate ourselves in the current moment. As many know, Friends has faced a lot of backlash since our founding years. In the episode that Lindsay shared and that you both were featured on with the Quaker podcast, Jane Calvert was the other person who spoke a lot on that episode, who's a historian of Quakers and of Quaker political thought. And she shared how Quakers have had to navigate the relationship between their religious commitments and their responsibility to their communities as public servants. It was and continues to be a hard balance to find, but Friends across the centuries have continued to be active in diverse forms of public witness. I also love this quote that was shared at the beginning. That's something that you mentioned, Emily, which is, "I am not saying that our experience of urgency and crisis is not real. I am saying that we need to not be swamped by it, that these big waves that may be coming at us require us to hold on to what we know can be our anchor. And for that, we go back to those Quaker practices that our people have been doing for centuries." And I just love that quote. It was actually featured in our Quaker Context newsletter that came out a couple weeks ago, talking about elections and this democracy work. So for our second question, I want to continue on this thread and ask, what have you seen be the strength that Friends and also possibly other faith communities bring to political and social discourse? And or if there is a challenge that has been present across the work, have you found a particular tool in our Quaker toolbox that helps you navigate it successfully?
I'll jump in. So I think FCNL is an excellent model of how Friends try to practice being engaged in democracy in a nonpartisan way, in a way that is open and listening and engaging and holding true to the core principles, the core policy positions that Friends have helped discern through a long process that many people in this call have been involved in. But I think it is a model for that faithfulness of practice that Friends call to really engage in the political process in that way. I'll tell you, not working at FCNL, it's a little bit of a relief to not have to be nonpartisan all the time. It takes work to be in that space, and I really respect the lobbyists and the advocates, including all the grassroots advocates who work with FCNL, who are really willing to say, I will talk to who my elected officials are, just because I disagree with them. In fact, more importantly, because I disagree with them, I may need to talk to them. So I think that's really important. I also think people rise to the occasion. I mean, on the one hand, we're going to talk a little bit about how this election season can be unnerving because of the uncertainty, because of the outcome. Something that we may disagree with could happen. Something that we could agree with could happen. But it's a very for many people, it's a time of anxiety, but it's also a time of celebration. I mean, if you care about the fact that we can vote, and that's happening, and people are proudly displaying their badges that they voted, and they're encouraging other people to get out and vote, that's a good thing. We're working to try to assure that will be available to people the way people before us worked to assure that. I mean, I think about what civil rights workers have done for a century, in a sense, about trying to attain the vote, preserve the vote. When I think about the work that Black people have done in this country to try to build this democracy, it just stuns me. It makes me revere the fact that there are people who've gone before me who have done so much to try to create a democracy. A democracy that now I think has a lot of flaws, has a lot of problems. And I hope we can talk about that more as we go forward. But in this moment, in this week, when we're 6 days out from election and people have chosen already how they're going to vote, how they're going to engage, how they're going to work over the next 6 days, they're just rich and incredible opportunities for all of us to be engaged now. So I'm excited about that. And I hope we'll also talk about what that looks like after November 5th, what it looks like throughout the rest of the year, what it looks like next year, because in fact, working to try to not just protect democracy, but rebuild democracy is a lifelong commitment that we all need to be engaged in.
Yeah, I think I want to lean into the question about what faith communities bring to our discourse, which was a really hard question for me when I first heard it, because I was trying to answer like with one answer. And then I realized after a little while that I can't do it that way, because if the question is, what do the Quakers bring? What I see in that is the sense of the meeting stuff that I was talking earlier. But then there is something different that the Catholics and the Jews bring, which is this incredible sense of continuity and ancientness through the millennia, and the idea that we are having one moment now today, but this will go on, the relationships between people and between people and God. And I think about spending time with Buddhists who show me about like act in the now and release the result, and how much that can contribute to the social discourse. And then I think about, I spent some time with a Pentecostal Bible study in Indiana. I went every Thursday for like several months, and they were so incredibly good at a couple of things. One thing they were really good at was boundaries. Some things are right and some things are wrong. And I wasn't always in agreement with them about what was right and what was wrong, but I loved that they had clarity that some things are right and some things are wrong, and there are eternal principles. And the other thing that group of people taught me was to value everybody's gifts in such an incredibly concrete way. Like there was one night when a guy, he described himself as homeless, and he showed up with a rabbit for Bible study that he had shot and roasted. And he wanted to share this rabbit that he had roasted, and we passed it around. And it was an amazing experience, because it was like this gift that he had brought to all of us. So when I think about what the faith communities bring, I think about it as being like we are all bringing something different to the table. And it's a question of what do we accept from the other groups. And just acknowledging that there is something beyond us. If there's a collective thing we bring, it's that there is something beyond us and now, that recognition.
Thank you so much, Emily. I really appreciate your engagement of the spectrum of gifts that faith communities bring to this work, and also how there are some of those shared concepts that we can use to guide us as we're all trying to discern our way in this work. And just like the diversity that we see across faith communities, when we look at the larger state of American politics, we see a broad range of beliefs. And it's not just about who we want elected as our next president, but also foundationally around what problems are possibly the highest priority, and what paths we can use to solve them. Emily, I want to come back to you because one of the ways that you move through your election violence prevention program is centering each community's experience with this work of preventing election violence and of building stronger social fabrics. And also how the specific steps taking place in certain communities, like in rural Michigan, most likely won't work in a place like Atlanta, Georgia, but are connected to that larger goal that you were referencing of creating peaceful relationships across our communities. So I want to ask you this question about what your impression about how to balance those individual and collective experiences is with the bigger picture of doing this work, and how you've seen it throughout your work. I can
No, it's okay. About that balancing of individual and collective experiences, you know, when you use the same metaphors over and over, you get boring, but I cannot get away from the idea of the table that we bring something to, or the puzzle for which each of us has a piece, because that just, to me, that is how to move through the world. So when I think about questions about like, you know, the same strategy isn't going to work in multiple places, there are basic principles when we're talking about things like preventing violence. There are best practices, there are evidence-based ideas that come out of research from international contexts, but we can't apply them the same way in every local area because every local area is so different from every other. So I guess what I try to do is talk about some of the greater principles and then encourage people to engage with each other and figure out how to apply them. There was a great story. There were two people in a weekend-long training together who were talking about how to engage with police in their local areas and how to make sure that police were well trained in de-escalation. But one of them came from rural Wisconsin and the other one came from inner city Philadelphia. And the one from rural Wisconsin was like, I actually know our police chief and I'm just gonna go to him and like have a conversation. And the one from inner city Philadelphia is going, I could talk to a new police person every day from now until 2026 and not meet them all in my city. And so it's a whole different thing about going through the political system and figuring stuff out that way. Storytelling and learning from each other. That's the only way forward I have. It is not efficient. I can't tell you how many times people have asked me, like, are there not 5 easy steps that you can just give us? Like, tell us the 2-minute version of how this work happens. And that just isn't how this work happens. And I think we all know that.
And I know some of your work, Diane, is different than the work that Emily has been doing within her traveling ministry. You have extensive background as a friend and also a leader among interfaith communities when you're with FCNL and as you've been continuing your engagement in public policy. So what has your sense been from the experiences that you've had and how do you use those to approach this work?
Well, thanks. I just want to piggyback a little bit on what Emily said about the local work, partly because we have friends on this call from Whidbey Island, and I know that they have been engaged in a really deep conversation, with people in their community across political differences in ways that is patient and curious and grounded. And I see in the chat someone talked about being curious, and Trish mentioned the idea of that a lot of the work is listening. And again, these are some of the practices we have as friends. And so thinking about how we engage those across political differences is really important. But I think that idea of like the long-term commitment is huge, and building that kind of commitment at a local level or in a community. I just to talk for a second about the interfaith work. I think it's really powerful, both when it happens at a local level, because we're stronger when we actually do appreciate the charisms that other faiths bring. And I think it is just because we're people of faith doesn't mean we agree on everything. And so I think that is one like natural community to begin a dialogue. At FCNL, it was really heartening to work with other and I know this work continues. This is really important. I mean, I think the example that I just give is that, I know people will be hearing much more about this at the annual meeting, but the letter that's just gone out that many faith organizations have signed on to, calling for an end to selling weapons to Israel in violation of some of the for reasons we all understand. But that letter that they've signed on to has been signed on to by many faith communities. It's not only friends, and that there is a power in that when various voices coming from different perspectives, and particularly the fact that people, just because I think the practices, I think the people of faith that I've worked with tend to be fairly thoughtful about how they're pursuing something. And so I think there's a value in that. So just to say, I think that's important. I think I might have lost the thread though, Micah. You were asking about, yeah, I'm sorry. I'll pause. I'll just stop there.
Yeah. Thank you for that response. Just talking about how we're engaging diverse communities, you mentioned a little bit about how important it is to do it on the local level and how that kind of builds up to our the way we engage as a whole nation. And as we're doing that, building up, one of these threads that is really important in this conversation, that some friends have mentioned in the chat and that you mentioned at the beginning, is this aspect of truth and how that's become a little bit warped in current politics and engaging with the people around us.
Micah,
And-
can I just jump in here for a second? Because one of the things I want to say that I know that people who've been part of FCNL hear this, and the people who work at FCNL have experienced this, that we hear in the media, I mean, we're not talking about the media, but we really need to recognize how much the media influences how we respond to a lot of what is happening, because that's often whatever source we're using to get our news impacts us in a pretty big way. But if you're on the ground working with Congress, there's a lot of work that happens that is actually bipartisan. And we don't always hear about it because it may not be the biggest thing. And I think at a local city council, there are definitely fights that happen at local city councils. And there's some places where there's a lot of brokenness, but there's a lot of work that goes forward. And so I think it's also really important to recognize that while there are systems that are broken, and that is problematic, and it could lead to violence, there are things that do work. And so I don't want to lose sight of that. And it's really important for us to kind of focus both politically and locally at when something works, how do we build from that?
Thank you for that flag. That's, I think, a really important point. Especially as we balance this work. Our final question before we move into a Q&A section with those in attendance is about this bigger picture of democracy and society in the US, and honoring the fact that there are things that we want to improve, but also that there are things that do work, and how do we build on those, like you said, Diane. We haven't had a chance to kind of dive into some of your work with the Quaker call to action. So that's one thing that I do want to hold some space for, since that's been a lot of work that you've been doing over the past 2 years. The original statement from the Quaker call to action came out in May of 2022. And then there was an updated one released this past spring. And there's a quote that I wanted to highlight, which talks about truth, democracy, equality, and civility continue to be under unprecedented attack by some authoritarian movements in our society. And many of those are anchored in the tenets of white supremacy, and they're aggressively pursuing an agenda that counters a lot of the values that Friends hold. So in connection to some of the work that Emily has been doing with the rise of election and political violence, what have you experienced throughout your leadership in politics and interfaith spaces? And how does this relate to your motivation to be involved in the creation of the urgent call to action for Friends?
So just to say, the Quaker Call is a group of volunteers, and it started off with about 25 friends or so who began to talk about how at the beginning of 2022, how do we think about the impact of the MAGA movement, and in particular, what the fact that there was an ongoing belief that Trump and a lot of the MAGA movement, that he had won the 2020 election, that was a stolen election. I mean, you could see that it was going to cause fractures, that enough people believing that was a stolen election would create a real crevice in how people participated, because it certainly questioned the electoral system. It undermined, despite the fact that every contest or every effort to try to prove that it wasn't stolen was sustained, that in fact it was a fair election, but that it would cause differences. And so that group came together to ask the questions that we're asking. It's like, well, what can Friends do? And essentially, I think a lot of our work, we kind of developed a steering committee that helped create these calls and send it out to Friends across the country, just mostly our own networks, and also that it spread, where we had some Quaker meetings endorse it, and we had individuals endorse it. And the effort was really just to ask people to consider these questions, and consider them both in terms of what it meant from a spiritual basis, but then also what it meant from a particular call to action that people might experience. And so people have experienced in different ways. And our work has been to try to provide, we've had national Zoom calls where we've offered educational programs, and then we've had national Zoom calls where we've offered a time of worship. And I would say that people have appreciated all of it. And for much of the time when people come together, they're grateful, just as this call, we're bringing people from all over the country. People are really grateful to be with one another, both in terms of having time to listen and talk. And sometimes we did worship sharing groups and times for worship. And the fact is that there are scores of democracy organizations that we don't necessarily need to reinvent the democracy organization. I mean, there are scores of great groups doing really fine work. And so one of them that we connected to is called Protect Our Election, which was really trying to support and understand how people who are election workers need support, because many of them have been threatened since the 2020 election, and try to figure out how can they be supported. Some of it is for people who are wanting to be poll workers, but this is all nonpartisan work. And then there are people who are doing partisan work as well. So it's been a variety of efforts to try to raise it. I think there are a lot of friends who are already engaged politically, and I'm not sure that our call made that difference. But I think what it did was it began to consolidate the fact that this is a deep concern. And I would say for me personally, what it's done is to understand that this work of rebuilding, renovating democracy, I believe is something friends, I hope, will be called to beyond this election, because the need is so clear. And it might be in the form of addressing how do we do violence, political violence prevention. It could be in the form of how do we actually reform our electoral systems, which is some work that FCNL has worked on. There's a whole lot of ways that it could be done, but I just think it's incredibly important. And I think some of that will stem from this Quaker call to action, which has been gratifying. I mean, the group of people has been very great to work with. It's primarily retired heads of Quaker organizations, with Gretchen Castle, who's still working full-time as the Dean of Earlham School of Religion.
Thank you, Diane, so much. As you mentioned, some of the work that we're doing is education-based, is empowering people to get involved in political processes at the local, state, and federal levels. If you're interested in some of what those programs are, Lindsay's going to send that link in the chat that FCNL hosts, as well as there's a lot of organizations doing programs like this, including the Quaker Call to Action, including local organizations. And we want to make sure that those are shared and uplifted, because we don't want to be repeating efforts when friends are already working hard to do these things that we know need to be done in community. Emily, as we wrap up this final question, I want to hear from you. I know you've been involved in this election violence prevention work for the past year, really focusing on the lead up to our elections. I'm just wondering, as we close this section, what are some of the actions that we can all take as we navigate the work of building, of renovating our democracy and trying to build something better for ourselves as well as people that come after us?
You know, one of the things Diane talked about was the media, and we get told stories about people who are voting differently than we are, or living in a different part of the country, or whatever. And sometimes those stories are true, but very often they're not. Very often they're oversimplified. I could talk to you about data. The Princeton Bridging Divides Initiative has data that shows us that the actual rate of people who approve of political violence is less than 2%, regardless of political party, but each party tends to guess that the other side, it's more like 20% who are approving of violence. So that's not true. The ugliness that's happening to local officials, and somebody mentioned it, poll workers in the chat, that's happening. And it's happening at exactly equal rates, regardless of whether those local officials or poll workers are leaning right or leaning left themselves. That, again, that's data that we have. The severe violence is more likely to come from the far right. That's the one factual point. But a lot of this problem is across the political divide. And instead of giving you more stories or more data, I just want to tell you a story about what it's like to challenge the narrative that we're getting from the media and from our echo chambers. I make it a point to go into a variety of spaces. I do things like I worship at a synagogue, but before I go in, I talk to the protester outside. You know, it's those sorts of things. And one of my favorite experiences in the last year was actually at the Braver Angels National Convention. To understand the story, you need to know that we were voting on something. You don't need to know what we were voting about, but we were voting on something. And we had made an agreement that we were not going to do the thing unless X percentage of reds, X percentage of blues, and X percentage of others all approved of the thing. So that was our agreement going in. And they had this system worked out where we would vote by smartphone, and then all of the voting would automatically be tabulated, and we would know if we needed a second round of voting. But then, of course, not everybody has a smartphone. So then there are people just walking around handing their smartphones to each other so that everybody can vote. And then there's somebody whose job it is to like play the piano while the votes are being counted. So there's this guy who keeps jumping up on the platform and he's playing like Where is Love from Oliver, which is pretty, but it's also about an orphaned child. And so I'm sitting there going, have we thought this through? And after like 5 rounds of voting, and the reds and the blues and the others are all passing their smartphones around, and everybody's exhausted, and it's the last day, and we're also hungry because it's supposed to be lunchtime. There is a point where the pianist is up on the stage and he's playing The Girl from Ipanema. So we're listening to like do, 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 do. And somebody in the room starts the chant, "This is what democracy looks like. Do, 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 do." And I almost cried because it was so ridiculous. But it was also a group of people who were in that space saying, I am going to get to know these folks. I am going to talk to my neighbors. I'm going to challenge the narrative. I'm going to engage. And that is what democracy looks like. Girl from Ipanema, I think, is optional.
Micah, can I jump back? And I love that story. And honestly, I think, you know, we've heard stories too from people who worked in the 2022 elections where they were like a woman who was talking about being a poll worker and spent 12 hours in the polling place with someone who, she was a Democrat, the other person was a Republican, and they had this long, you know, conversation over the period of 12 hours because they were sitting in the same space, both upholding democracy. So these kinds of encounters are really important. I also want to underscore what Emily said about culture, because I think so much of how the divides are happening are both our culture, you know, culture is feeding, you know, a lot of the differences. And I think it's really important to pay attention to that. Not that policy isn't, policy is important. I completely agree with that. I also just want to speak just for a second about this question of what we expect of our elected officials, because someone asked the question about Gaza. And like, I think probably everyone on this call, I am horrified and angry, very angry at the fact that my government is funding those weapons. But I was angry about the fact that the US Congress approved over $30 billion in a 10-year funding of weapons when Obama proposed it. Okay, so there's plenty of blame to go around, not in terms of what's happening to Gaza now. I think that's a little bit more directed in terms of Israel's decision to do that. But no elected official is going to be everything or do everything that we want. And so it's important to think about what is it we want from our government and what can we get from the people who we elect. And that goes to how we engage now in actually going out and voting, because that is the simplest and most important thing that we can do. And if you take anything from this call, if you haven't voted, you can vote early, go do it, vote early, and certainly do it by next Tuesday. If you know anyone, you know, that you can encourage to vote, get them to go vote. but then it is after that. I mean, it is building those relationships. It is building an understanding and being engaged, not just with Congress, which is really the focus of FCNL, but understanding. I mean, you know, back to the local level, if you know the people who are on the Board of Education or the county commission, and you can like talk to them about something, that is worth gold in building a social fabric in your community and helping bridge the sort of cultural differences that may exist, even in communities where you think that, oh, people are much more like me than they are like somebody else. It's really, really important. So I just want to underscore that capacity to think, you know, choose where to get involved, but be involved somewhere, because, you know, your community needs you and the country needs you, and it's really important. I just want to say one other thing, and I'm happy to cede the floor, but I just came back from Michigan. My daughter's working on she's working as a regional coordinator for Get Out the Vote for the Democrats in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And so I went out to see her, but I spent some time canvassing while I was out there. And I feel so much better after doing that. When we were on this call last week, we were getting ready for this, and I said I was feeling really anxious, and going out and just actually doing some work makes us feel better. And so choose where you want to be engaged. It may not be for a political candidate or for a political party, and it may not be even, you may not be able to do something this week, but if you're feeling frustrated or even frightened, think about how to build community. I just go back to where Emily started about building relationships, and particularly building relationships maybe with people who are the unlikely suspects, if you might.
Thank you, Diane. I think with that, we're kind of wrapping up our formal discussion for this evening. We do have one last question that we'll offer you both at the end to send people off with some more inspiration and hope. But at this moment, I want to invite friends, if you haven't already, if you have any questions for our speakers, to send those in the chat, and we'll get those to them either at this moment or connected afterwards. We did get some questions beforehand that I'll start with one of them, because it seems that there's an overall theme of concern for friends, not just friends, capital and lowercase friends, physical safety during this time. And I just want to ask you both, with some of the election violence that we're seeing, and just with people being scared, about what can you offer friends in this moment on how to hold that fear and how to move forward and possibly through that. Emily, do you want to go first, since this is somewhat up your alley?
Yeah. So we're really close to the election now. And preventing election violence is a discipline that usually starts 18 months before the election day. What I talk to friends about now is not preventing violence, but preventing ripples of violence. So if something does happen, what we do in response can make a difference in whether that leads to additional ripples of violence. So things we can do, I'll tell you the same two really big things that I told friends in Western Yearly Meeting the day after the first assassination attempt on Donald Trump. There are two things that are huge. One is just to reach out to somebody on the other side of the political divide, and you do not have to talk to them about politics. Call somebody on the phone and talk about your cats. It doesn't matter. What that is about is reminding them and you that you are both human beings. That's what that is about. And if enough people do that, it has an effect of calming the tension. And the other very important thing to do if something happens is to be as careful as you can about the truth. We don't repeat rumors. We don't share something on social media that we do not know absolutely for certain is true. We try really hard not to make assumptions. So whatever happens, it's about reaching out and trying really hard to stick to integrity. And those are the things that are likely to make the ripples less large.
Thank you, Emily. That's a great reminder, especially as we operate so much of our lives on these virtual platforms. I say funnily as we're on a Zoom call currently. Another one of our questions that was asked at the beginning of this call that Diane, I would love to hear some of your thoughts on is, how can we as friends best respond to some of these lies and disinformation that's directed to political opponents? Emily talked a little bit about the personal, about how we can manage that on our own individual social medias. But specifically as friends, do you have a sense of how we can approach some of this?
Well, I think there's a kind of a witness that friends have played and that people have done of just showing up and holding space, holding a room through grounded prayer or grounded, intentions for outcome. I've seen that happen in outdoor settings, but I've also seen it happen in a room where there's a sense of anxiety and I've been in a space. I served on the Board of Education, 20 years ago in my actually longer than that, in my town in Connecticut, and there were meetings that were tense and it just not being reactive, and not repeating falsehoods, but to get to clarity and to try to sort out what was happening. I mean, that was a unique situation, but I think that I think our ability to try to listen for what is listen for what is the problem, and then listen for what is the thread of truth, and to name that if it is a situation where there's a meeting going on. And I think, we may be playing different roles, because if you're in a position of being an elected officials, it's a little different than if you're in the room. But I think that kind of willingness to be present, we as friends don't have collars that we wear. I mean, there's this, I know Bridget Moix is going to go and be a poll chaplain, and that's a big program that Face United to Save Democracy has been promoting. And I think they encourage people to wear vestments if they have them. But
Roger, Catlin,
sorry.
FaceTime video.
Sorry, I'm getting a call. That people are, but if you have something that says, I'm a Quaker and I support peace, that's not a bad thing to wear. I mean, I think I think it's actually important to be known as someone who supports peaceful solutions. I think it's important to be known as someone who wants to pursue truth and is willing to do that. Is willing to do that in a way that isn't partisan. And so that nonpartisan nature, again, I'm just going to come back to FCNL and say it's very important. It's actually very important in some circumstances. But I also think it's important, I guess I just say that I think when, depending on the circumstance you're in, and I think this is where calling back and kind of being grounded before you speak, but being willing to name what is the truth for you. I mean, if you're engaged in a conversation and someone says, I think this is wrong, and you understand it to not be wrong, like whether it's about a stolen election or whether it's about a position and why you hold that position, we need to be able to speak about why we hold the positions we have. I think that's a fair thing to do, but not to do it in a rancorous way. There are ways that we can have disagreements. We have them all the time. We have them with our families, we have them with our partners, and we need to learn how to do it at a social level back and doing it in a political way as well.
Thank you so much, Emily. I think that's calls back to how we honor that of the divine in each person, even if they believe the exact opposite of what we believe. There's a reason for that, and God is present within them as well as within us. And our search as friends is to find that light and to honor it within everyone. So, friends, we are getting to the end of our program. There was an additional question for resources that was sent ahead of time. So we'll follow up in our email that'll go out at the end of this week with some additional resources about how, not about how you can be a poll chaplain, but some of the things that poll chaplains are being trained to do, you can do informally as a friend as you're in the process of voting, with an honoring of those that are doing this officially and following their lead in these spaces. But it's important to note that we can take on peacekeeper roles in everyday life, and we should. As we close up this conversation, Emily and Diane, as two friends who have been doing this work for years and putting a lot of energy into it, day in and day out, especially in the past couple of weeks. One thing that I've been experiencing just as an individual doing this work as well is a lot of this election anxiety about the election and then about the state of democracy. I realized as I was overviewing this run of show that, oh, I'm a little bit pessimistic, just kind of irregardless of what happens, I'm just concerned. I know a lot of friends are hurting right now, and sometimes it's hard to see the way forward. But thankfully I've gained a little bit of that hope back, but I want to invite you both to share a little bit about how you stay grounded and take care of yourself as you're doing this work and throughout this time, and possibly what advice you might give to the people listening who may be feeling similar stress and concerns. Emily, do you want to start us off, and then Diane can close us out for the evening?
I guess for me, it's about remembering that this is actually physiological. I mean, it is about spiritual grounding, absolutely. But I don't know that I believe that our spirit is a separate thing from our physical body. There's a guy named Luis Mojica who works with trauma, and he says, you cannot, like physiologically, you cannot experience empathy if you're in fight flight kind of mode. It's just not possible. You can't do it. So a lot of this is about regulating your nervous system. And for me, that looks like if I'm anxious, I need to take a walk. Sometimes a long walk, sometimes like an hour and a half if I can do it. I have certain music that I know will pump me up, and I have other music that I know will settle me down. Just before I hopped on this call, I watched the finale of Billy Elliot the Musical because I needed a little bit of ramping up. Hugs regulate our nervous systems. They do amazing things. And if there is not a huggable human accessible to you, stuffed animals or weighted blankets are almost as good. So it really is about knowing, what does my brain need? What does my body need? And then leaning on the spiritual practices we've been doing for years and years, worship and prayer and music and all of those things. Self-hugs work too, says Trish. Absolutely.
And also cats and dogs, Emily, that you could hug them, and that could be, or, you can have a little affection that way. But I think those are all really great. I would agree that it's having, for me, being outside really makes a difference, and particularly like to be walking, to have movement, to pay attention. I mean, if you're in a place that has foliage, wow, that's just, that's like bonus, right? And the weather has been kind of really remarkable. So I think it's, at least where I've been, it's important also to find people who you like to hang out with, and not talk about politics. I mean, talk about, what you cooked or cooked together or something like that. So I do think there's a lot of self-care ways to pay attention. And then I think it's also, I mean, I'll just share it just briefly. I know we're at the end. After January 6th, I was still working at FCNL, and we were kind of in lockdown, so we weren't coming into the office very often. But I used to primarily take the metro in when I went to the office, and I could drive down at that time. But when I drove by the Capitol, FCNL's office is very close, 2 blocks from the Capitol. It's just a beautiful location, and if you haven't ever been to the office, you should definitely go visit. But there was black fencing all around the Capitol. I mean, the whole grounds were cut off. I mean, almost across the street. In fact, it was across the street from FCNL's office. It's that close. I literally cried. I wept because I honor this place as someone who's a citizen of this country and cares about it and cares about the democracy. And yet I knew that this work would carry on. I mean, and it did. 10 days later, there was an inauguration of Joe Biden, and we've carried on. Regardless of whether Kamala Harris becomes president or Donald Trump becomes president, we will carry on in terms of the advocacy for policies. And if the policies change because Donald Trump becomes president, and I am worried that they could in dramatic ways that would harm the environment, that would take away people's liberties and freedoms, we will work for resistance. I mean, that's what will happen. And we'll figure out how to do it in solidarity, and we'll figure out how to do it in a way, I hope, that doesn't involve any violence, but that involves dialogue and that tries to build relationships like we've talked about, because I do think that's central to being human. We're all human, right? Let's be human together.
Yeah, I think as we close, that's where my strength has come from, is from seeing and hearing friends, both upper and lower cases. I like to make sure I'm talking about, but as they're both standing up for justice and peace in whatever form they can, in whatever way they can that lives into their spirit. And also just choosing to recognize that divine presence that's in every being, that's in the earth, that's in the air that we're all sharing. Even when it's hard, especially when it's hard, because that makes it all the more meaningful and all the more moving. That's an actual witness, continuing to do something even when it's hard. Taking a breath to close up this wonderful program, I want to offer immense gratitude, love, and light to Emily and Diane for joining us, and all those who joined as listeners holding this space. Our conversation focused on a lot of these larger systems that we're seeing in the United States, a little bit about election violence, some weighing of the truth in these systems that really matter for our daily and collective lives. But throughout the evening, I really listened to you two both speak about the power of community and the power of building connection with the people around you, and how as we do that in little bits, it really adds up into the work that we're trying to see on the big scales. If friends need to hop off right at this minute, feel free to. I'll follow up with a little bit more information, but I want to offer just a few announcements as we continue to approach and move through this season. The last reminder is that I really want to encourage you all to take care of yourselves, as we just focused on in that last question. Take care of yourselves, take care of your loved ones. Really, it's a hard time. And it's an important thing to remember as we're doing this work, that we can't continue to give and give until ourselves are falling away. We have to let our cups overflow with love and light. An offering that FCNL is hosting is Friends Holding Space Together, which is a worship series with some other Quaker organizations around the election, knowing that we're stronger when we're in community with one another. And those can be found at fcnl.org/election worship, including our normal Witness Wednesday silent reflection time. I also want to encourage, again, I know both of our speakers have mentioned it, to go out and vote. It's one of the best ways to make sure that your voice is heard. I know a lot of people in my generation say, oh, it doesn't matter. Things are going to happen the way they're going to happen. But that's a small act, that's a big act. And encourage people to come along with you. It can be fun, it can be empowering, it can be the event of the next 4 years, literally. Also on November 3rd, in relation to some of Diane's work, Quaker Calls National Zoom Gathering for Worship will be happening, which my colleague Lindsay will send a link to in the chat, but will also be in the follow-up email. We focused on this evening a lot about the external work, about our witness in the world. But my colleague Alicia McBride and Jose Santos Moreno, as I mentioned, will be talking on Monday about some of the internal work about this. Alicia will be speaking to that, and Jose will be speaking to some of the laws and ways that we engage in this work on the national level. And also, if you are interested in some of the policy work that FCNL is engaging in, specifically around Gaza, that was mentioned, FCNL's Quaker Public Policy Institute, an annual meeting, is coming up in 2 weeks, from November 13th to 17th. It's not late to register virtually, which I know some friends are considering because of some concerns about travel or space, but it's a great way to attend some of the programs. And as we've done tonight, we are able to build community over these virtual spaces, and we should utilize these tools. I think we've absorbed them into our Quaker toolbox, at least at FCNL. We'd love to see you at all of these events. And also our last reminder, as we close out this year of 2024, we would love to invite you to save the date for our next Quaker Changemaker event that will be on December 11th from 6:30 to 7:30 p.m. It will be in relation to some of what's going on in Gaza and how Friends are specifically called to act on that witness. Thank you all for joining this Quaker Changemaker event on Friends Witness and Action for Our Democracy. I send you all forth with light and love and gratitude.